Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we deepen our exploration and dialogue around the meta theme that we have articulated for 2023, and that is the issue of apology. As we look around the world, humans are causing so much suffering to each other, so much suffering to the earth, that quite literally, humanity stands on the precipice of self-destruction, along with a million other species that are endangered and in the duress of possible extinction. The world is increasingly turbulent ecologically. The world is increasingly conflicted geostrategically with the war in Ukraine and many other areas around the world that are experiencing economic, financial, and political conflict and turbulence of all kind. So we have been looking at the situation from the point of view of consciousness, from the point of view of apology and reconciliation and reparations and healing. Because it's only the shift in consciousness that is going to enable humanity to remember who we truly are as children of Mother Earth, as part of nature. And today, we want to embark on a 5-day program on what we're doing collectively to the earth. We're going to explore the poisons that we are putting into the earth and now into our own bodies because of the ubiquitous presence of one particular poison called glyphosate. We'll be diving into that more deeply in a moment. But before we do, let us pause as we always do on Humanity Rising as we engage in our sessions. It's so important as we navigate our way through the thicket of contemporary existence that we build community, that we build coherence as community. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is to open our hearts and simply breathe together. So in a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear that sound, just breathe in very slowly till you hear the sound of another bell, and then just breathe out. It's about 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out. For 5.5 breaths per minute, that brings in 5.5 liters of air. It's the most effective way known to create coherence and well-being, emotional equilibrium, and mental acuity in our bodies. Thank you, everyone. Let us breathe together, and then we'll embark on our program. Thank you, everyone. It is so good to breathe together and to feel a kind of coherence that if all humanity could experience together would enable us to rise to where we need to be to save ourselves from the habits and behaviors and the momentum that is leading us to increasing devastation of each other and this precious, precious planet that has given us so much life, so much beauty, so much caring, and wants to do that if we just remember who we are and return home. In this spirit, I want to introduce my very good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington, who's been one of the pillars of Humanity Rising as we have been building our program and our distribution over the several years. He's the CEO and founder of Endangered Global. He's a consultant, executive coach. He's passionate about the environment, about nonviolence, and about social caring of all kinds in our world. And he's convened this 5-day panel, really asking the question, how did we get here? And is going to focus our attention on the issue of glyphosate. So Tom, welcome. I know you're moving, and so you've stopped along the way somewhere. And so double thanks, my good friend, and I turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's great to be here. And I think what I'm particularly excited about this week is this concept of how did we get here? You know, we, over the last year plus, Humanity Rising has been focused on what we've called code red issues. And with each of those code red issues, there's a history, there's a series of beliefs and assumptions and a level of consciousness that created the crisis that created a code red. And so this week in particular, in the, following the theme of endangered over this last year, where we covered topics around climate change and biodiversity loss and other dimensions of what endangered encompasses. This week in particular, we're going to focus on glyphosate and how did we get here? What's the history of the chemistry? What's the history of the poison that has destroyed our topsoil, which is essential for carbon sequestration and climate change. It's affected our food systems. It's affected our healthcare systems. So really looking forward to the conversation this week with the extraordinary panel of guests. Today, we've got, and I'm very excited to welcome Carrie Gilliam. Carrie's an investigative journalist and author with more than 30 years of experience covering food and agriculture policies and practices, including 17 years as a senior correspondent for Reuters International. She's won several industry awards for her work. Her first book, Whitewash, The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer, and the Corruption of Science, was released in October of 2017. She won the coveted Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists, as well as several other awards. Her second book, a legal thriller titled The Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice, was released in March of 2021. Carrie's been asked to speak all over the world about food and agriculture matters, including before the European Union Parliament in Brussels, the World Forum for Democracy in Strasbourg, and to public officials, organizations, and conferences in the US, Canada, Australia, France, and the Netherlands. She's also been a invited lecturer in several universities, including Emory University, Berkeley Law School, Washington University, University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, University of Iowa, and the Cambridge Forum and Harvard Square. Also joining us is Claire Robinson. Claire's the co-director and co-editor at GM Watch, a public news and information service that counters the spin of the agricultural biotech industry on genetic modified foods, crops, and associated pesticides, including glyphosate. Together with two genetic engineers, she's co-author of the book GMO Myths and Truths, A Citizen's Guide to the Evidence on the Safety and Efficacy of Genetically Modified Crops and Food, which is now in its 4th edition and is available from Amazon. She's authored articles, reports, and scientific publications on the effects of glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides on health. Welcome, Carrie. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Well, it's terrific to have you both here, and I couldn't think of two better people to start this week, just to provide our audience over the course of the week with some of the history and some of the impact that glyphosate has had on our topsoil, on our food systems, on our health systems, and frankly on our legal system and our political system as well. And so I'd love to kick it off with you, Carrie, and just share a bit about what brought you to this journey of glyphosate in particular, but more broadly, agriculture and food systems.
Sure, thank you. It certainly was not a journey that I chose or that I set out to pursue. I was a journalist covering the banking industry, actually, and Reuters, the international news agency, asked me to move to Kansas City and cover the commodities market, hard red winter wheat trading at the Board of Trade, and also to really dig in and start understanding this company called Monsanto that was based just down the road in St. Louis, Missouri, and was revolutionizing agriculture through its introduction of genetically engineered crops. This was in the late 1990s. And so, I didn't really know a lot about agriculture, and but I moved to Kansas City, and I was actually born here, so it was a nice return home, and started digging in and started learning about the company, about the agrochemical industry. Monsanto not only was selling these genetically altered seeds that they had developed, but they were selling this herbicide, glyphosate-based Roundup, and other brands, other products that were made with this novel weed killer that was supposed to be so safe and effective at killing weeds. And so farmers embraced this. They were using these new crops that Monsanto had rolled out that were tolerant of glyphosate-based herbicides. So farmers could spray this chemical directly over their growing corn or cotton or soybeans, and the weeds would die, but the plants would not. And it was really a very important change for farmers in agriculture, and it was having ramifications throughout, the economy for agriculture, the crops that were chosen by farmers to grow. We were learning about impacts on the soil, on biodiversity, on human health. So studying this and learning this and spending a lot of time actually in Monsanto's headquarters, speaking with Monsanto officials, farmers, regulators, distributors, scientists. I just kind of got sucked into this very important issue. And now I'm so glad I did, because of course we all eat, right? And I think agriculture and food and farming is the very most important industry for the direct health of all of us. And it led me to a place where I was no longer invited to Monsanto headquarters. They didn't like the fact that I started, writing about science that did not reflect well on the safety of glyphosate, and raising questions about, do we really need these genetically engineered crops? Who really is reaping the benefits of these? Certainly, it's not consumers. So, it's been a long journey. I've been covering this industry now for more than 20 years, and left Reuters. I write now for a very small news outlet that I kind of run with Environmental Working Group called The New Lead, but also for The Guardian, so you can find my articles there. But it's been a journey, and it's been really eye-opening, and has led me to a place where a lot of you are with a real concern for the future health of the planet and our families, our children, not just because of glyphosate. I like to say glyphosate, I think, is the poster child for a much bigger problem, where we have corporate capture of our regulators. We have these dangerous pesticides that are not regulated in a way that adequately protects public health. So, we could talk all day about this. I guess we're going to talk quite a bit longer, but I will turn it over to you guys now.
Thank you, Carrie. And Claire, what brought you to this area of focus with your life?
Yes, thank you, Carrie. Like Carrie, I did not intend to get involved in glyphosate or in pesticides in general, but I was working with GM Watch from the 1990s. We were looking at what was happening with these genetically modified crops. I'd already been alerted by scientists that there were problems with genetically modified crops, both in terms of the crop itself, which they warned because of the genetic changes that are made in GM crops. They were warning that they could prove to be toxic or allergenic. And also the first GM crop that was really rolled out on a wide scale was Monsanto's genetically modified glyphosate tolerant soybean. And that was planted in vast acreages in North and South America. So I was keeping an eye on what was happening, particularly in Argentina. In Argentina, they turned over huge acreages to growing this GM soy. And a lot of the GM soy was being used for animal feed. It was imported into the EU. Even though the EU does not particularly like GM crops, the population here is extremely resistant to eating GM, and the retailers don't like it, so they've pretty much excluded it from food. This GM soy was being imported into the EU to feed animals in intensive feedlots. So it was coming in. I was warned that the GM crops would probably be containing glyphosate residues. So who knew what that did? When I first started raising the alarm about this, I thought to approach groups that were working on pesticides, environmental groups. And I said, are you concerned about the amount of glyphosate that's being used on GM crops? And every single one of them told me, absolutely not. They said they were not concerned because glyphosate was a very safe herbicide. I thought, okay, I was momentarily reassured until I started doing research on it. And I found that while the regulators worldwide were actually claiming that glyphosate was very safe, it was as safe as table salt, some people were saying, the industry was, of course, saying it was totally safe. Gardeners were using it. At the time, we were buying vegetables from a local grower who called himself organic. He was not registered organic, but he told us that he grew organically. And one day I visited him and I saw a can of Roundup, in his greenhouse. And I said, oh, you use this stuff? Yeah, he says, it's fantastic. It's organic and biodegradable. And totally safe. So anyway, around that time, this was, by now we were in about 2010, and I started hearing reports from Argentina in particular, from people who lived there and scientists and doctors saying that vast amounts of glyphosate were being sprayed from the air, from airplanes, onto the GM glyphosate tolerant soybeans. And the rural peoples were suffering from very high levels of cancers and birth defects. And this was a new thing for rural Argentina. The doctors there had never seen these problems before, or maybe they had only seen one case or two cases in their entire career. And all of a sudden it was a common thing. So this really woke me up to the fact that there was something bad about glyphosate. And I started researching, and then I was contacted by a scientist called Dr. Andres Carrasco in Argentina, and he had done research in embryos, frog and chicken embryos, and he had found that by exposing them to glyphosate, you produced birth defects, deformities, abnormalities. And he said this absolutely correlates with what we're seeing in the people in Argentina. So 2010, GM Watch started writing about this. I think we were the first people to write about this problem in the English language. There was some stuff being produced within Argentina, but it was not getting out there in the world. So we started putting it out there. We did get mercilessly attacked. Our website got attacked and taken down several times. And year by year, the research started building up. And our first concern was birth defects. That was what we were focused on, but also secondarily the cancer issue. And we started publicizing that. We did that for many years. And slowly, the photojournalists and the journalists started catching on to this story. They started sending teams to Argentina to document what was going on. I viewed it as a kind of a human rights issue, really on a par with slavery, in that this was something terrible that was being done to people in a country far away. So a lot of people in Europe, and I suspect in North America, didn't know about this issue, or perhaps didn't care about it even, because these people were far away who were suffering. But of course, we were all, in a sense, utilizing those products, just as with slavery. You know, we were importing sugar, importing tobacco and cotton. We are importing this stuff, this GM feed. And it's a really, really serious human rights issue. And then I think a few years later, the focus shifted a little bit to cancer. And that was where the International Agency on Research on Cancer came in with their decision that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen. So then the focus slightly shifted, and Kerry, I think, has done amazing work in bringing this issue to the eyes of the public. So I think I'll stop there so I don't monopolize.
Thank you, Claire. Kerry, back to you for a second. So you mentioned you were spending a lot of time at Monsanto in the early days, and granted, they have become a bit of the poster child for this, and it's not like glyphosate is the only toxin that's being used in agriculture. But I'm just curious, when you were meeting with and spending time with the folks at Monsanto, and getting back to the whole purpose of this broadcast, which is Humanity Rising, can you talk a bit about what your experience was of I'll call it the consciousness of the people you were meeting with and working with within the organization?
Sure. I think this is a question that comes up a lot, when you're dealing with companies that are selling products that, later we find that they're dangerous, right, or deadly. And did they know? Who knew? Why would they sell it? Why would they do it? And I liked a lot of the people there. I mean, their chief technology officer. I mean, their president, Brett Begeman, who grew up, as a Missouri farm boy and came to rise up to be president of the company. And a lot of people, I think it's hard to understand the psychology behind it, but I think it applies across, a whole range of industries, right? And we, particularly in the United States, we're very focused on success and power through wealth and, pleasing our investors and double-digit earnings growth. And it's all about money and sales and growth. And if everybody around you is saying this is the greatest thing and it's wonderful and it's safe, that you just adopt that message and you adopt that mindset. I find it hard to accept. I'm not that cynical yet, I guess, that there's was somebody toiling away in a dark laboratory going, we know this is going to kill people, but we don't care. There's some emails that get kind of close to that, I guess, but I can't really speak to that. It's like so many things that we see, when there's an incentive for great wealth and great financial gain, people make excuses, right, for things. And certainly glyphosate, even though we're focusing on this here, and there is quite a lot of science out there, and there are a lot of things I hope that we can discuss about why it is such a problem. One of which is because it is the most widely used herbicide in the world in all of history. And that's a big part of this, right? I would venture that if we used glyphosate in a more restrictive manner, it wouldn't necessarily be worth highlighting as the terrible impact on the environment and human health as it is. There's a large component here about the fact that regulators have allowed this to be used just ubiquitously. It's in our water, it's in our air, it comes down in rainfall, it's in snacks and cookies and cereals, it's in organic honey, documented it that way. So it's really become almost impossible to escape. And that's a big part of the problem. But certainly there are other pesticides like paraquat, for instance, which are much more deadly on an acute basis, certainly, and just as dangerous perhaps on a chronic basis in terms of chronic exposures, and chlorpyrifos and atrazine, all of these that are sold by other companies, Dow Chemical, DuPont, it goes on and on and on. These chemicals, by their nature, are toxic to life, right? They are supposed to kill plants or insects or fungi, and so it certainly isn't that surprising, I don't think, that they would be dangerous for human health as well. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I get that asked a lot in terms of Monsanto. But no, I mean, I encountered people who, were really proud seemingly of what they had brought. Certainly glyphosate, when it was introduced, was much more effective and safer than paraquat. Certainly paraquat was introduced by Syngenta, an herbicide that if a tiny teaspoon or so splashed up into your mouth, or you were accidentally ingested it, it was likely that you would be dead in 2 to 3 weeks. And that's how toxic that was. So glyphosate was welcomed by farmers very much when it came to market in the 1970s.
Yeah, I've certainly noticed, and I see it in the chat as well. A number of people have mentioned they're shocked when they go into local retail stores that it's still available, it's still sold, it's still something that's heavily used. I've talked to the manager of my local hardware store where they sell it, and he said, we sell it because people buy it and we get demand for it. And so part of the programming this week is to help inform and educate people on what's happening and the impact that it's having on human health. And
yeah, and I would say, I mean, I used to buy Roundup, it worked great. I mean, I didn't have a farm, I had a house, right? I have a house, and I don't like weeds in my yard, and so I would buy Roundup and spray it, and it worked really great, right? And safe for pets and people, supposedly. And so it makes sense. It's hard for just a consumer to understand, when you're doing that, what are the impacts on the soil? What are the impacts on plant health? If you're getting this on your skin, if you're not wearing proper protective gear, they don't know of the dermal absorption studies, right? That the company and other scientists have looked at that show how easily it gets into your bloodstream and moves throughout your body. So, these things, it's all about education and engagement and awareness, and just what you're doing here today.
Yeah, I'd also like to add that it's very, very important that the regulatory authorities around the world are pressured to make public the studies, the industry studies that form the basis of authorizations of chemicals like glyphosate. This was a real wake-up call, actually, to us. Back in the 1990s, there was an approval, an EU approval of glyphosate, whereby the German authorities were looking at the industry studies, and they did their report on glyphosate, and they concluded, okay, it's safe, it can be marketed. Now, I think we were probably the first people ever to approach the German authorities and ask them to see the studies that they based this approval on. And the German authorities, I have to say, they were not rude at all. They were extremely polite, but they said, This is a lot of information, and it's very hard for us to pull together and access. So they said, we will get it together for you, but it will take some months. So we said, fine, okay, we'll wait some months. And several months later, true to their word, they sent us some CDs, because in those days, that was how the information could be collected together. They sent the CDs, and we looked at those industry studies. I got together with a group of scientists, and we looked particularly at the studies on whether glyphosate caused birth defects in the experimental animals. And my goodness, we were so shocked and surprised that there was clear evidence of birth defects caused by glyphosate, even at the lowest doses tested. And time again, the industry would come out with excuses why this particular finding should be disregarded by the regulators. And the regulators always agreed with Monsanto or whoever had done the study. In particular, they used to use a kind of ruse called historical control data, where they would compare the treated animals, the animals that were exposed to the glyphosate. They wouldn't just compare them to the control group within that study, which is the way that you are supposed to do it. You have a group that's exposed to glyphosate and a group that is not exposed to glyphosate, and you compare to see if the exposed group has more birth defects, more cancers, etc., than the control group. Now, this is not what they were doing. What they were doing is they were taking control groups from all the experiments that had ever been on glyphosate. So there was such a wide variation in the data that basically they lost any effect of the glyphosate in any one study that they looked at. It may be hard for the layperson to understand, but this is basically it's a scientific fraud. They were using the wrong control group. They were producing this incredibly wide range of effects, lots and lots of birth defects in many of the groups, and therefore they were able to just wish away the effect of the glyphosate. They said, oh, this is just random. It's not an effect of the chemical. In one case, there was a skeletal malformation that they were trying to explain away. And they said, oh, this is not a malformation. It's just a variation. Now, for a moment, again, I thought, am I going crazy? Maybe it's me who's got it wrong. So I looked up in a toxicology textbook, just a bog standard textbook, which gave a definition of a malformation. And it actually talked about this particular skeletal abnormality. And it said, this is not a variation. This is actually a malformation. And it was there in black and white. And we wrote a report on this called Roundup and Birth Defects. We afterwards put out a peer-reviewed study on the same findings. And I think that whole experience was a major wake-up call for us. Years later, we also worked with some scientists on the cancer findings in the industry studies. And we found that right from these studies started in the 1980s on the birth defects and the cancers. And so we know that there were certain toxicologists within Monsanto who actually knew that this substance was creating birth defects, was creating cancers. They were clever people, so they found excuses for the chemical. They said, oh, this isn't a real effect. We're not seeing that the toxic effect increases in a straight line with the dose. Well, guess what? It doesn't always do that. Sometimes you don't get a steady increase with the dose. You get very strange dose response effects, as they're called, non-linear. They don't necessarily go up in a straight line with the dose. So all these excuses were being made by the industry. They were being accepted by the regulators, and they knew about these effects, the cancers and the birth defects, from the 1980s. Now, I don't think that contradicts at all what Kerry has just described, which is that in any company, there's a huge number of very good people who believe in what they're doing. They think that they're helping humanity, that glyphosate is genuinely safe. These studies were probably only seen by a very few people. and they contained that information. They did not put it out in the company at large. They lied to the public, they lied to the regulators, they made excuses. And as a result, I think the world has been taken in by the supposed safety of this chemical. And I totally agree with what Kerry says. Glyphosate is not the worst one that's out there. It's actually pretty low on the scale of toxicity. But when we think of the number of chemicals that are out there for very dubious purposes, often, things like killing weeds, which 9 times out of 10, you don't have to use a chemical to kill a weed. There are other ways of doing it. There are also shifts in mindsets that can be brought about, whereby, for example, on verges, road verges, we don't mind about the so-called weeds that grow there because they're actually biodiversity. In France, they have stopped using weed killers on their streets in the cities, in Paris and so forth. They don't use weed killer anymore. And you see these little flowers, growing between the cracks in the pavement, which is a great thing. It's producing a shift, I think, in public consciousness that weeds are not necessarily our enemy. They're just a plant that's in a certain place. And for farmers, they may be a problem, but there are other ways of dealing with them other than blanket coverage of herbicides.
Yeah, I always go back to just thinking about what is a weed. It's just a plant that's growing someplace that somebody doesn't want it to be.
Right. Yeah. And we should say, maybe this is a place to discuss this. It's just a bad practice to use a weed killer in the way that we have used glyphosate for the EPA to allow it. And I write about it in my book, back when Monsanto introduced these genetically engineered crops and said, hey, this will be great. You can spray right over your whole field, right over the growing crops. And the crops won't die, right? But the weeds will. And farmers are like, whoa, this is amazing. I don't have to till my fields. I don't have to have all of these other things that I've always had to do that are much more labor intensive. But there were some scientists and others who were saying, well, this seems like a bad idea because Mother Nature is going to adapt. And so if you keep doing this, right, the weeds are going to become over time resistant. And then you're going to have to use more and more. Well, it's great for Monsanto, right? If weeds get harder to kill and you've got to use more of the chemicals, your volumes go up, right? Which is exactly what we saw happen. And you make more money. And that's what happened. And it's fascinating. When I was doing it, I fascinated myself, I guess, in doing the research for whitewash, because there were so many red flags raised by scientists who told the government, who told the company, this is a bad idea. Weeds are going to become resistant. You're going to have to put more and more. Eventually, glyphosate's not even going to be enough. You're going to have to put other chemicals on these weeds, more 2,4-D, more dicamba. And the company kept saying, no, you're wrong. Trust us. It was not until 2011, 12, 13 that Monsanto had to acknowledge, I guess you were right. There are weeds that have become so resistant in cotton country in the South that farmers have had to resort back to putting people in the fields and cutting by hand because no amount of chemical can really take care of the problem. Weeds that I saw would go out in the fields with farmers here were taller than the farmers, and getting stalks like small trees to a degree. You can't really mess with Mother Nature in that kind of an aggressive way and think that you're going to come out, on the good side of it. And so we're in this situation right now because we've used it so heavily on these genetically engineered crops. Glyphosate really doesn't do the job by itself anymore. So what the companies have come out, Monsanto and others have come out with new genetically engineered crops that are also tolerant not only of glyphosate, but of these older herbicides like dicamba, like 2,4-D, which was part of the Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam. And the use of these chemicals now has skyrocketed, kept glyphosate up with it. You're having more and more problems in the fields. I think it's, GM Watch and others who have characterized this as this pesticide treadmill, right? This treadmill that you can't seem to get off of. If you're going to be relying on these chemicals, you're going to become ever more sucked in as the farmer. You're spending more and more money. Your soil health is becoming more and more depleted. Your crops become more vulnerable because they're not having the microorganisms that they need in the soil, because the soil is being sterilized by all of these chemicals. It's just a really vicious cycle that's affecting, production, that's affecting biodiversity, the nutrient value in the crops and the foods that we're all eating. So there's just so many different elements to this that we can explore, and very few of them are good, and getting back to the science on this, there's been science raising the red flags for decades. And it's about the environmental impacts as well as the human health impacts. And yes, there very clearly was fraud involved. I mean, people went to prison. There was a Monsanto toxicologist who went to prison for his role in fraud with relationship to scientific studies that were presented to regulators. And we have the mouse study. You talked about the reproductive studies. The mouse study, we don't have time to go through the whole thing, but that was introduced to the EPA, the Monsanto secret mouse study that was given to the EPA, where EPA's own scientists, this was in the 1980s, looked at the data and said, yeah, this looks like it causes cancer. Look at all these mice exposed to glyphosate that are developing these rare tumors. This should be classified as possibly oncogenic, carcinogenic. And Monsanto, fought back, said, absolutely not. You're not interpreting it right. Let us tell you, EPA, how you should be interpreting the science. Let us bring in, an expert pathologist to guide you and to look at the tissue studies. And eventually, the EPA, they brought in a scientific advisory panel. The advisory panel said, you know what, make Monsanto redo the study. Monsanto said, absolutely not. We're not going to redo it. It kept pressuring EPA top brass, and eventually the EPA caved and overrode their own scientists to side with Monsanto. And that was the classification ultimately in the early 1990s, in which the EPA said, we see no evidence of carcinogenicity. We're going to say it doesn't cause cancer. It's not likely to cause cancer. And that then allowed Monsanto to do everything else, to say, then we can spray it directly on food crops, we can do this and this and this. So it does all go back to the science, and ignoring the science that was out there, even Monsanto's own science, as well as independent science, is really what's gotten us to where we are. And it's really unfortunate that our regulators are not held to account for this.
Yeah. And interestingly, we got together with a few scientists to have a look at these cancer studies that Monsanto and other companies submitted to the EU regulators. And the toxicologist that was working with us, Dr. Peter Klausing is his name. He's a German toxicologist who used to be in the industry. So he's used to looking at these studies, and he found that 7 out of 12 of the industry studies on cancer effects with glyphosate were actually positive. In other words, they showed a cancerous effect. And yet the regulator said, oh yeah, these ones are not reliable. The ones that are reliable are the ones that didn't show any cancerous effect. So again, it was industry making excuses for its own chemical, and then the regulators would not actually only believe the industry, but the regulators would come up with their own excuses to try to give glyphosate a free pass. We see this happening time and time again, and I believe it's because there is so much industry influence on the regulators. You have industry-linked people sitting on the regulatory boards. You have very frequent communication between the industry and the regulators. These conversations that Carrie describes in her book, where you have the company writing to the regulators saying, let us tell you how you should be interpreting this. Now, this goes on you get the feeling this goes on routinely. Whereas groups like us, groups like Pesticide Action Network, who are very active on pesticides, do we have that kind of access to the regulators? No way. We're really, really lucky if we meet one person from a regulatory agency once in a blue moon, and they basically don't listen to people like us. They don't listen to independent science. They prefer to listen to the industry. And I really think that they are far too close to the industry. And that goes for the EPA, it goes for the German authorities, it goes for EFSA even in the EU. All these regulators are highly compromised, and they need to just step back. They need to be basically purged of everybody with an industry connection, and for some genuinely independent scientists to be brought on board. And I suggest that all their procedures need to be made public so we can actually see how they're reaching the decisions that they are reaching. And they need to publish the data proactively. So it shouldn't take people begging and asking for it and court cases, forcing disclosure. That information should be available on the internet, published proactively.
Yeah, thank you for that, Claire. When I look at, the information that's been released recently that, the petroleum industry knew in the 1970s that they were affecting the climate on the planet. The tobacco industry, classically, the lobbying that they were doing there about the impact of smoking. We can go industry by industry and agency by agency, and we've seen, at least here in the U.S., most of our agencies have been bought by industry, and the impact that it's having on citizens. And so that's one of the areas where I was hoping we would cover today is what can we do about that as citizens? Certainly the GMO Watch and your books, Carrie, are part of the solution in terms of educating people and making it available. Broadcasts like this are part of the solution, but I'm curious to hear from both of you what some of your further thoughts are on what can be done about our government regulators and the agencies that are owned by industry.
Claire is much more of an expert on this than I am, right? Because my job as a journalist is just to, put the information out there. But personally, as a mother of 3 kids, learning what I've learned about the whole variety of pesticides that are used in food production and how the residues remain in the finished foods, and how a bowl of strawberries, conventional strawberries, might, according to our USDA and FDA data, have 20 different pesticides, the residues of 20 different pesticides in these healthy, fruits and vegetables you're serving your kids. So I try to avoid that. I try to buy organic if I can. It's not a perfect system, but it seems like a way to try to reduce pesticide exposure through the diet. I don't use Roundup anymore on my lawn. I'm starting to try to learn to love dandelions in my life, the little yellow dandelions that pop up. I don't know, right? It's very difficult. I do feel really strongly about this revolving door that Claire mentioned, and I try to engage as a voter when I'm looking at candidates and who to support. I really want to hear from people and would like to hear more about their views on food policy as opposed to foreign policy, or in addition to, and what they see in terms of how do we bring in people who are knowledgeable and have expertise in these areas without bringing them in from industry, without having that industry bias. And it is, our agencies are just overrun with industry affiliated people, and the EPA in particular. There's just so many. So we can talk more about that. I'd let Claire jump in though.
Yes, I think I agree with all that Kerry has said. I think that we can do more to force transparency in our regulatory agencies. We can kick up a fuss when they appoint industry-linked people. In the UK, we've just had an appalling situation where we have some committees that are going to be evaluating GM crops for release in this country since we Brexited from the EU, which means we're no longer under the protective EU rules as they exist at the moment. And masses of these people have industry connections. They have vested interests in the products that they are supposed to regulate. So how are we expected to get any kind of objective opinion from these people? It's beyond belief, really, that this can happen and for there not to be a revolution. But I think on the personal level, I agree that we eat organic in my household. We have done since the 1990s, ever since organic first became available here. And I know that people complain about the cost of organic. It is more expensive. But on the other hand, we prioritize the food that we put in our mouths. You know, we apart from that, we have a very inexpensive lifestyle, should we say. So we just make that choice to prioritize the quality of the food that we put in our mouths. And the kind of farming model that we support as well. We're lucky to have some biodynamic farms near us, which the system kind of goes beyond organic. And they really are obsessive about the purity of their products. And we can see the difference in the produce. It's very lively. It tastes very nutritious. It's good food. The obvious thing is do not use pesticides in your house and in your garden or on your property. Do not absolutely minimize the use of chemicals. And I think the natural next step for a lot of people who make those steps is that they start advocating within their community for a stoppage of the use of useless pesticides. For example, we have a park next door to us where we live, and I've just found out that they do use glyphosate to clear the driveway. So we are going to be lobbying the council, who is responsible for that decision, to come up with an alternative solution. And in that particular situation where they're going to say, oh, we've got to keep the driveway clear of weeds because it's a safety problem. You know, somebody might trip over, or a car might be in an accident because there are weeds in the road. We're going to suggest things like hot foam, which is a glyphosate alternative. It's like a potato starch based product, and you put it on hot and the weed apparently dies. And I believe it's as effective as glyphosate. I know people who use vinegar to kill weeds in their garden. Other people use salt, which perhaps is not so good for the soil. There are alternatives. I mean, in our household, we just get down on our hands and knees and dig out the weeds that we don't want. But we have got a lot more tolerant towards so-called weeds. And in some ways, they're beautiful. I noticed somebody in the chat box has suggested that she eats dandelion leaves, and they are incredibly healthy. You can put them in salads. They are a liver tonic, which is very useful for people who have been poisoned by pesticides, because one of the first effects of pesticides, long before you're likely to get cancer or give birth to a baby with a birth defect, one of the major effects of pesticides is on the liver. It creates liver toxicity and kidney toxicity. And it has been found that dandelion is a great liver detoxer. So all these things that people can do. I also encourage people to be more suspicious of so-called experts and so-called regulatory agencies, and really look into whether they may be not telling the truth or being economical with the truth. I think that people's awareness is growing. I think that popular books that have come out, books like Carey's, films that have been made about the problem of pesticides, I think these are all good signs that people are waking up to these problems.
So I would just ask the two of you, when you both have been deeply involved in this subject for quite some time now, what are some hopeful signs, and what are some things that are giving you hope that there's a possibility that things will change?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in on that one very quickly. I think I'm encouraged by how the young people are very much waking up to the problem of pesticide-grown food. They're questioning whether we actually need to use these pesticides. I have met a number of young people now who are trying to get access to land to become farmers. That in itself is a problem, because land inequity is a major problem here in the UK. Basically, if you want to be a farmer, you have to be very, very lucky to get access to some land to actually grow crops on. But these young people, I think every single one of them that I've met certainly has no interest whatsoever in using chemicals. They want to use natural methods. They want the animals, if they're livestock farmers, they want the animals to be healthy. They don't like intensive farming conditions for animals. They know it makes them unhealthy. And I see that I feel that these practices, growing food with pesticides and intensive farming for livestock, I see these practices as old school practices that I think have a sell-by date on them. I think people are waking up, and increasingly the people who defend these methods, they always appear to me to be kind of old. I mean, I'm old myself. I'm not dissing old people here, but they seem to be old. They seem to be overwhelmingly white Western European types or Northern Americans. And I think, you know what? You are not the future. You're on the way out, basically. And maybe it's one of those situations where I've been told by scientists that you don't ever wait for science to change its paradigm. You know, it has to be that the old generation of scientists just dies off and a new generation takes their place. Maybe it's going to be like that. I don't know. But I do have hope when I meet these young people. So over to Carrie.
You're right. You're so right. You know, I sit here and I just think there is no hope, but you're right. There is. And right here in the US, we have a group, many groups actually, but just a group that I'm familiar with that started in Berkeley, college kids who became aware of all of this and said, we don't want this sprayed on our, practice fields where our students are playing sports. And they went to the school district and talked to them, the maintenance people, and they worked out, a ban basically on using glyphosate on the school grounds. And they've expanded and they're going around the country, and they formed a nonprofit now. And there's another nonprofit I'm familiar with, Non-Toxic Irvine, started in Irvine, California. Same thing, just little steps, showing the science and the information to city council members, right, or school districts, and basically convincing them to try a different strategy. And farmers here in the US that I've become familiar with in the Midwest and written about, they call themselves the Idea Network. And of course, there are many others not part of this network, but young farmers who are saying exactly that. We want to do something different. We want to use cover crops and do more crop rotation and integrate, livestock and animals into this to provide, a more fully integrated vertical operation with the fertilizer from the animals and the consumption of some of the grains or the hay that we're growing. And you are starting to see the USDA provide more incentives and some subsidies and some payments to incentivize farmers to do this, to move away from this conventional, pesticide dependent system. They're really very small steps. I mean, the USDA programs encouraging farmers, is still just a drop in the bucket to the subsidies and the incentives that they're giving to the farmers who are engaging in this heavy, conventional, industrialized, chemical dependent agriculture. And that's because of the industry lobbying and the industry impact on, how funds are allocated in Washington, D.C. But I do think you're starting to see a realization that we can't stay on the path that we're on. We just can't. It's not healthy for the planet. It's not healthy for people. So we need to change. We have to change. And you're seeing small steps, I think.
I think one of the things, this may feel like a tangent, but I think it's going to be increasingly important, is the fertility crisis that's particularly affecting, I hear, America, but also Western Europe in particular. Really, it used to be a very unusual thing for a couple who wanted a baby not to be able to conceive. It was by far the exception. And it's becoming more and more the norm, which is extremely worrying. And based on what I've seen of the research on pesticides, I know that a lot of them are endocrine disruptors, which mean that they interfere with the hormonal system. They do interfere with fertility. They interfere with normal birth, in that women who are exposed to glyphosate, for example, are more likely to give birth to preterm babies, and also to have babies with developmental issues and abnormalities. So I think this particular crisis, this reproduction crisis, fertility crisis, is going to force people to look more closely at how we grow our food, at nutrition, and also the poisons that are presently sprayed on our food. I was lucky enough to meet the I guess she calls herself an anthropologist, but it's Dr. Jane Goodall, the chimpanzee lady, who has done such brilliant work making people realize that apes are sentient beings, and they have their own intelligence, and their own they deserve respect, should we say. And I was talking to her about the problems that we're involved in GM crops and pesticides, and of course she doesn't like either. She hates GM crops, she hates pesticides. And she said to me, whatever gave us the idea that it was a good thing to grow our food using poisons? And that's become a quote now that she's put out worldwide. And it is absolutely true. It's a crazy idea. I think that in future, people will look back on this era and see it as a crazy anomaly that we decided to grow food with these poisons, which are basically war chemicals. They came out of the Second World War. They were used to kill people. Organophosphates were used as nerve gases. And the nitrates were used to make explosives. And after the war ended, these chemicals were just repurposed and used on crops. And this is something that suits the pesticide industry, but it really doesn't suit humanity as a whole. So I think this is an anomaly, and I think it will go away eventually. But in the meantime, we have to proactively fight it and make sure it does go away.
Before I invite Jim back in, any further thoughts from you, Carrie?
No, I'm glad that Claire brought that up. I don't know if anybody listening to this is familiar with Dr. Shanna Swan and her book Countdown that came out a couple of years ago, but really did lay out, the just terrifying impacts that we're seeing on human fertility, reproductive health, and the ties not only to pesticides, but also other environmental toxins. But certainly herbicides, glyphosate and other herbicides, there's studies ongoing right now tracking pregnant women and their birth outcomes and measuring their, serums for the presence of these pesticides. And the early results are not good in terms of birth outcomes and gestation, gestational length and the impacts on the children. So, it is something that is important to the future of the human race, right? Our children and grandchildren and their children, and something very important to pay attention to.
Well, welcome back, Jim. Encourage you to jump in with any observations you have about the conversation.
Well, first of all, Claire and Carrie, thank you so much for the starkness of your message today, that humanity really has to pay attention to these things. And just to get the ball rolling in a little bit of an amplified direction, going to the root of why we're so dependent on these. I read an article just a couple of weeks ago saying that worldwide, the male sperm count has gone down by about 50%. And they were making 2 points. Number one, it's not just human, but all kinds of species are experiencing infertility because the males are no longer capable of impregnating the females. And one of the major reasons, according to this article, was the massive amount of estrogen that is being put into the environment because so many women are using the pill. And through menopause and so forth, doctors often recommend estrogen therapy for women at that level. So it's not only childbearing people using the pill, but then menopausal, and that's flooding the ecosystem with estrogen. So in addition to the glyphosate issue and the pesticides, what we humans are doing, we're literally flooding our bodies. My understanding is there's upwards of 100 chemicals in the human body that were not in human bodies, say 75 years ago. So that the issue, and would love to have your comment, is certainly glyphosate is an issue, and poisons are a rather dramatic instance. But when you look at what we're spewing out into the environment at all kinds of levels through our technology and chemical formations in just about everything that we do, we get a measure of the danger that we're in at this moment, as the human race is listed now as one of the endangered species. So and the reason why I'm raising it is because, going back to Tom's question early on as to kind of why Monsanto, how do we get into this in a way that is so broadly accepted by governments and by regulators? I think one of the issues that we have to grapple with, given what you said, and also just the general information out there, is that we have a blind faith in technology. And I would say, better living through chemistry that the Rockefeller Foundation made so famous and broadly accepted literally over 100 years ago, so that humanity has been raised and framed within this optimism that technology can somehow fix every problem you've got, whether it's a weed, or it's getting to the moon, or it's developing plastics, or all the range of gadgets and scientific instruments that we have, so that the problem that we're facing is one of a whole worldview. And that's what, in my estimation, makes it so challenging, because the glyphosate issue is a subset of a general acknowledgement on the part of humanity that better living through chemistry and technological innovation is somehow going to lead us to the promised land. Just would love to have your comments.
Totally agree with you, Jim. I couldn't have put it better myself. I see this mindset really infecting the government in the UK at the moment, and many leaders worldwide. They somehow think that we can do business as usual, we can carry on with all our bad habits, and there will be a techno fix. GM crops is one of those, by the way. It is a complete illusion. GM has given us nothing that we actually need, and it's created a lot of problems in its wake. And pesticides are a similar thing. We know that we can farm without them, but for some reason, people are just enslaved by this idea that technology is the answer to everything, and we can do what we want with chemicals and we can manipulate nature. One scientist who is engaged in genetic engineering in this country actually said to me, well, nature makes mistakes. Nature is a mess and we have to fix it. We have to make it right with our GM crops and our chemicals, put everything right that nature has made mistakes on, which again, I think this is a declining worldview that is on its way out, because that worldview is in itself unsustainable. If you go around with that attitude, you will eventually be disillusioned if you just keep your eyes open. So it is something that's going to collapse. Like all empires, it will collapse. And what we'll be left with is what's real and what's true. And that'll be things like people understanding the soil, knowing how to grow healthy plants for healthy bodies, healthy livestock. Those things will last.
Thank you. Carrie.
Gosh, I don't know that I could improve upon that answer, so I hesitate to do so. I think the points you've raised are great. The plastics, and I mean, virtually everything that we see as a benefit or an advancement, cars, transportation, that sort of thing, comes obviously as with not only with the rewards or the benefits, but with risk and sometimes dire risk, right? Short-term or long-term. And the problem that I've come to understand with a lot of these things is that the risk is often hidden, right? We aren't given the truthful information so that we can make really informed decisions about what we want to purchase or what we want to consume or what policies we want to support in Washington, D.C., because we're only given half of the argument. We're giving the argument about the rewards and the benefits. And there are very powerful forces. We haven't even talked about it today, but propaganda, front groups and other organizations that exist solely to serve the industries that are pushing, fossil fuels and plastics and pesticides, and put out just directly false information, knowingly false misinformation designed to mislead consumers, keep them in the dark, designed to mislead and confuse lawmakers and regulators, and to create so much noise and so much doubt that it's very difficult for people to fully analyze and understand the risks. And without that transparency, as Claire brought up earlier, it is very difficult. It's easy to say plastics are bad, let's get rid of all plastics. Is that really possible? I don't know. But certainly we can reduce use of plastics, right? Certainly we can look into better recycling. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do, but we have to fully understand, I think, both sides of the equation to be motivated and engaged to do that, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I would just like to ask one more question, starting with you, Carrie, because I think most people would view Monsanto as a particularly vicious company, I would say, in the way that it has eliminated competition, in the way that it has sued farmers who inadvertently got one or two seeds on their land, and all of a sudden they've been shut down. There's been documentaries on the extraordinary lengths to which Monsanto has gone to not only deny the reality of the carcinogenic qualities of its Roundup, et cetera, but in forcing locations and farmers to engage in GMO farming, whether they want to or not. It's also worth pointing out that Monsanto, and Carrie, you may know the date, got the U.S. Congress to vote that you can't sue Monsanto, just like the big pharmaceuticals can't be sued for any of the vaccines. And so you've got an extraordinary vicious circle of denial and obfuscation, but then legal protection. And the question I would like to ask you personally is, given the fact you've written these books and you've been out there in a way, I'm sure there's probably a few others, but you have, as a journalist, have been bringing light to bear on Monsanto in particular. And I'm just wondering how you've navigated, and have you been threatened? How are you in your life, I would say, given the fact that you've taken on a company that has demonstrated extraordinary venom publicly and in terms of litigation against all perceived enemies.
Right. Certainly. Yeah. Venom is a good word to use, I guess. Yeah, certainly I have come under great attack for years and years and years. It started early mid 2000s when I was writing about their bid to introduce genetically engineered wheat, and I was visiting with a lot of wheat farmers and wheat growers, and exploring what was happening with markets that we sell to overseas and what their response was, and just really writing that the market didn't want this, that Monsanto's introduction attempt for genetically engineered wheat in the early 2000s really laid bare the fact that they were not providing something that farmers were asking for. They were rather pushing products onto farmers. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of where they turned against me. And then there were other, as I wrote the books and other things. But yeah, I mean, if you Google my name, I'm sure the first thing that pops up is not going to be positive. It's probably going to be one of the dozens and dozens of articles that have been written by front groups that we know are funded by Monsanto, now Bayer, which owns Monsanto, about my horrible character and my dishonest reporting, and how, I mean, there are things out there that I get paid by Roundup lawyers to do things, that I drink a lot, I don't know. There's a lot of things out there that are designed to smear my reputation. We uncovered or it came out through litigation, a spreadsheet that Monsanto had, the Carrie Gillam book project, I think it was called. The Guardian wrote about it. You can see the document and read the story, but designed when my first book, Whitewash, came out. They were ready. They had a plan. They were engaging groups to put stuff on the internet about me. They were engaging groups to, try to get negative book reviews written, just all of this stuff to try to discredit me, discredit my work. And I'm one person, right? I'm one little person. And they did the same thing to scientists with the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Anybody that raises a red flag, they've done it to other journalists, to scientists, to academics, anybody who's not on board, that didn't put out the message that Monsanto wanted to put out, they spent a lot of time and money and effort to tear those people down. And so it was very intimidating. It's been very intimidating for a lot of people. I've spoken to a lot of people who absolutely are not going to go on the record, or are not going to pursue research in a way that might jeopardize their job or their funding if it conflicts with Monsanto's goals. It was, it's brilliant on their part. It's also incredibly deceptive, right, and unethical. We have emails from one group that were able to come out from one group, the Genetic Literacy Project, where they are bragging to Monsanto about all the things that they've been doing to defend glyphosate and to put out messages that it doesn't cause cancer, and thanking Monsanto for all the money that they've given, but asking for more. We really need more. And you see Monsanto writing back and speaking internally, and then writing back to them, saying, you're not going to get a better, what is the line? You're not going to get a better bang for your buck, right, than giving money to this group, this front group. So, and it was addressed in the litigation in the courts. They spent in 1 year like $17 million on misinformation strategies. And the judge in the case even made a comment at one point, if you spent this money doing better studies, to really understand the health hazards of the chemical, wouldn't that be better to spend your money that way than spend your money on misinformation. And, such a good point. So, but this happens over and over and over again. So yeah, I saw it firsthand. It's terrifying what they do to people. Monsanto's not the only company. I think they're probably the best at it. maybe not Exxon, from what I've heard. I mean, Exxon's pretty good too. So, but people have to factor that in too. You have to really navigate this world of what is true, what is not true. It's not an easy task, certainly.
Well, thank you for your courage and your integrity. Knowledge, because I read the Monsanto papers and I thought, wow, this is a courageous woman.
I'm just writing about courageous people.
Carrie, Claire, what about you?
Yeah, on a lesser scale, I think, because I'm not as famous as Carrie, but GM Watch has been going for a long time. And over the years, we have attracted a lot of smears on the internet. The same front groups that Carrie was talking about publish articles about, we're a terrible group of people at GM Watch, and we have strange conflicts of interest. And I think at one point they were saying that the organic industry was funding us. It would be great if that was the truth. We would welcome that.
Yeah, you wish it were so.
So far they haven't, but maybe they should. And similarly, they said, oh, the livestock industry is funding us because we were casting doubt on the environmental sense of setting up big factories to make lab-grown meat, bioreactor technology. And we were pointing out that these places would have massive environmental footprints and were not a good idea. And the next thing we knew, there was a story out there accusing us of being in the pay of the livestock industry. We were also accused of being in the pay of the pesticide industry. Oh, because we don't like GM crops, and GM crops were going to make pesticides unnecessary, which never happened, by the way. GM crops have increased the use of pesticides. So they said that about us. Our website, as I mentioned, has been attacked multiple times in the past and brought down, often at very crucial moments, just as EFSA or some regulatory authority was about to come out with some opinion on glyphosate or a GMO. All of a sudden, our website doesn't work. Fortunately, we have employed help on that, and we no longer have that issue, I'm very pleased to say. And I think regarding the personal smears, you just have to ignore it. But I must say, I do know a lot of people, as Kerry mentioned. I know scientists, I know plant breeders, livestock farmers and arable farmers who will say things to me personally in a private capacity, but they will not go on the record. They don't want their names used, and I completely understand that. I've also noticed that many environmental groups do not want to take on the GM issue because it is, as they put it, too contentious. And what they mean by that is they'll put out a tweet on their latest report or something on how GM crops are not very good. They will be attacked mercilessly on social media, as we are all the time. But we've just made a conscious decision, really, that we're not going to be intimidated with those people and those tactics. I'm in somewhat of an easier position than scientists, for example, who are in the front line. I've seen what has happened to some of the scientists who have published papers on the harms that GM crops have done in animal feeding studies to the animals that were fed the GM diet. And these scientists have been vilified publicly. They've lost jobs, they've lost funding, they've lost their entire careers. In one case, a scientist who came out with such findings was attacked so severely that he had 2 heart attacks very, very quickly afterwards. And his wife said to me, I know exactly what did this to him. It was the attacks that he was put under. So, you know, compared with people like that who are really on the front line, I'm really in a luxurious position. I don't have to face quite that level of hatred. You know, what we face is I think relatively trivial. But these are nasty people. The front groups that are employed by the GMO and pesticide industry are probably some of the worst people on the planet in terms of their integrity and the amount of pain that they try to put their targets through. So you just have to hope that some members of the public at least will not be taken in by these attacks when they read them online.
Well, thank you, Claire. Thank you, Carrie. Again,
thank you.
I want to just acknowledge and salute your courage and deep integrity. Just to take a stand, no matter what's coming back at you from the vested interests. So thank you both for starting off our discussion. Tom, why don't you close us out? Any comment you want to make, and then say a word about what we're going to be discussing about the glyphosate issue tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And Claire and Carrie, thank you both for being with us. I couldn't think of 2 better guests to kick off this week in this important topic. So as Jim mentioned, just thank you both deeply for what you've been doing for decades, the impact that you're having on informing and educating the public about things that matter. And certainly I want to echo Jim's comment about your integrity. I mean, it's just crucial that you have done and you keep doing the work that you're doing. So thank you for being panelists today and with us and sharing your knowledge and experience. Just really excited about the rest of the week. We're going to explore, you know, with Dr. Zach Bush later this week, the impact that this has had on soil and on human life. We want to be in conversation with one of the attorneys who was involved in successfully suing and winning against Monsanto. And we've got some scientists and a filmmaker who's going to be joining this week to just go deeper in learning more about this topic. And, you know, while it's focused specifically on glyphosate, it's really the bigger question of how did we get here? And what are we doing to ourselves and to the sentient beings in the planet? So excited about the week and grateful once again for the opportunity to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you to the listeners.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Carrie. That'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. We're really seeing profiles in courage, just to call up John Kennedy's book in the 1960s. And that's what makes humanity strong, and that's what enables humanity to rise no matter what the adversity. In the end, as you've seen, it's the truth that makes us free. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan has just put up. We'll see you tomorrow for our second of 5 programs on the glyphosate issue, asking the fundamental question, how did we get here? Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.